Well, welcome everyone to the NOVA Baha'i Center's series on the talks presented. Good start, huh? Anyway, this one tonight is the Life and Accomplishments of the Hand of the Cause, Leroy Ioas. And we're going to start with the prayer first. Is that right, Paymon?
That's correct. Thank
Okay.
you. Welcome.
Oh God, my God, aid thou thy trusted servants to have loving and tender hearts. Help them to spread amongst all the nations of the earth the light of guidance that cometh from the company on high. Verily, thou art the strong, the powerful, the mighty, the all-subduing, the ever-giving. Verily, thou art the generous, the gentle, the tender, the most bountiful.
Dear friends, our presenters tonight are Donush Rassekh and Hilary Chapman. Danush was born in 1946 and spent his early life in Europe and Indonesia. In 1958, he moved to the United States. In 1980, he pioneered in West Africa for the next 30 years. He served on the National Spiritual Assemblies of Senegal and Mali and was the Huququ'llah representative for Mali. He has worked for USAID, the United Nations, and in the private sector. In 2010, he settled in Canada and pursued property development. In 2017, he moved to the Northern Virginia area with his wife, Chahine, to help with the upbringing of their granddaughters. Hilary Chapman is a writer, co-authoring 6 books on the history of the Baha'i Faith. You can get them online at www.journeysfaith.com. A plug, Hilary. In addition to these books and short stories, Hilary is also a songwriter and a composer in Nashville, Tennessee. He is an accomplished guitarist, performing blues and country music. Hilary has served on the Baha'i administration bodies of New York City and Nashville. He has served communities throughout Russia and French Polynesia. Hilary is also a teacher lecturing on the Bible and the Baha'i Faith. He holds degrees from Haverford College, the University of Pennsylvania, and a diploma from the University of Paris. A 4th-generation American Baha'i, Hilary is the grandson of Hand of the Cause, Leroy Ioas, the subject of our talk tonight. It is my honor to present to you our distinguished speakers, Donush Rassekh and Hilary Chapman.
Thank you very much. Probably, like many of you, I did not know very much about Leroy Ioas. I had the bounty to receive from our precious Hilary Chapman here, son of Anita Chapman, whose radiant being many of us knew as the bedrock of the Washington, D.C. community, a book that Anita Chapman had written, and in it, Hilary has written, "I hope this account inspires you." I must say that this book inspired me without measure, and it stands out among the books of the Hand of the Cause. I recommend it highly. I'll try to share with you some of the glimpses from this book, which I hope will inspire you as well. But you really should read the book for a clear and broad historical understanding of the faith, from its introduction in the US until the passing of Shoria Effendi and beyond, the formation of the Council, Custodians, and the Universal House of Justice. Leroy Ioas was so involved in almost everything that happened in the faith that studying his life sheds light on the early history of the faith. The story of Leroy Ioas is a story of extreme devotion, inspiration, and accomplishments. Not only are we inspired by his accomplishments, but to quote Shoria Effendi himself, he said, "My heart is rejoiced and inspired by your devotion and accomplishments." Imagine Shoria Effendi making such a remark to someone when he was the cause of inspiration of so many, central and infallible head of the faith. I remember I was a child when, with my parents and sister, we had the privilege to go on pilgrimage and see Shoria Effendi. I remember the extreme reverence that everyone had for Shoria Effendi, with heads bowed in front of him. And imagine Shoria Effendi making such a remark to a human who he called by the title Hercules. So to give you an idea of what Shoria Effendi, and this was because everything that he asked Leroy Ioas to do, he was able to do. Undoubtedly, in the future, we will be studying more in depth and learning more about these gems and how their contributions helped shape the emergence of this new world order. Slide 3. With the passing of Abdul Baha and the appointment of Shoria Effendi as the guardian of the Baha'i Faith and sole expounder of its scriptures, a new era opened, a formative age in Baha'i history. And as you can read, this is when its institutions were formed, its laws and principles given application, and its great teaching missions begun. This was the work to which Leroy Ioas gave his talent and energy. I wanted to read for you a page, actually a couple pages from the Divine Advent of Divine Justice, but for the sake of time, I decided not to, but you're welcome. I invite you to go. I believe it's page 8, where Shoria Effendi lists all the accomplishments of the first 20 years of the faith in North America. Then when looking at Leroy Ioas and Sylvia, who spearheaded so many Baha'i activities during the period, we can have a better appreciation of the extent of their contributions. Charles and Maria, Leroy's parents, were Lutherans. They were seekers. They were Christian groups at the time that believed and spoke of the return of Christ and referred to as Adventists, Millerites, and other names. Maria and Charles were spiritually restless. Maria had prayed every day for 17 years to find the truth that she felt existed somewhere. 2 years before she and Charles heard of the existence of Baha'u'llah, she had a strange experience. She awakened during the night by a heavy pressure on her chest. An angelic figure seemed to be leaning over her and saying twice, "I come again, I come again," and then the vision faded. In April 1898, their path crossed that of Kingston Dealey, Canadian-born engineer who was one of the first Baha'is of Chicago. Dealey held classes based on the Huququ'llah teaching method in the north side of Chicago. Huququ'llah was a Syrian Christian Baha'i. And while Thornton Chase, the first North American Baha'i, held the same classes in the south side of the city. The technique was to present a series of weekly classes based on explanation of scriptures concerning the coming of Christ, the signs of the times, and the time of fulfillment. They attended 12 lessons, 1 lesson a week for 3 months. On the 12th, now I must say, during these 12 lessons, no mention was made of the name Baha'u'llah. And it took them over an hour to go from their home in the west side to the north, where Mr. Dealey lived, with streetcar, with a lot of difficulty. But they had a longing to know what the next lesson would bring. Maria was pregnant, but the urge to go was so irresistible. This quotation is from Maria on the 12th session. It says, at the 12th lesson, Mr. Leary told us that God, in his love and mercy for mankind, had again manifested his spirit on earth in a human temple in Baha'u'llah. She goes on to say, there was a stillness in the room. It seemed as if everyone's breath had stopped. It seemed as if it was too much for our hearts to bear. It was customary in the early days of the American community for those who grew to believe in the mission of Baha'u'llah to write a supplication to Abdul-Baha, acknowledging their belief and asking for acceptance into the Baha'i community. So as Maria recalled, shortly before midnight on July 6, 1898, my husband and I wrote our letter to Abdul-Baha and then went home so tired, but oh, so happy. This was just 5 years after the name of Baha'u'llah had first been mentioned in America. They were both recipients of beautiful tablets from Abdul-Baha. It was in this large and loving family that Leroy Ioas was born, the 6th of 12 children, born February 15, 1896 in Wilmington, Illinois, 2 years before his parents became Baha'is. He was a month older than Shoghi Effendi. Of all the Iowa's children, Leroy was the closest to his father. After graduation from high school, he enrolled in a business course, but it was the clarity of vision that he had, which enabled him to accomplish all that he did, as his energy went directly into teaching. Okay, Hilary.
The context, good evening, everyone. The context of Abdul-Baha's visit in 1912 is that the Baha'i Faith is growing rapidly. These small communities are finding seekers in Chicago and Wisconsin, New York City. And Abdul-Baha comes there. And one of the things that he's very concerned with is, first of all, teaching what Baha'u'llah's teachings actually are, and just clarifying concepts that the Baha'is had, generating a lot of spiritual energy for them, and also explaining to them this idea of the covenant. Because for the first four generations, Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, and then Shoghi Effendi, there was in the family and among the people around the early figures of the faith this very much jealous opposition. And so being firm in the idea that Baha'u'llah passed down the source of authority to Abdul Baha, and Abdul Baha to Shoghi Effendi, and then the Universal House of Justice, this idea of a covenant of authority, a covenant of belief, of accepting Abdul Baha's interpretation of the Baha'i writings and Shoghi Effendi's interpretations is the cornerstone belief to holding the Baha'i faith together as a single entity. Otherwise, it fragments into sectarianism. And Abdul Baha knew this danger. What we don't realize now in reading about the Baha'i origins is how much of that there was against Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha and Baha'u'llah. And you all are very knowledgeable, I know, looking around at the screen. But there were multiple attempts on lives, attempts to deport Abdul Baha. Abdul Baha used to forbid Shoghi Effendi when he was a boy to eat at certain people's homes for fear of poisoning. It was rough. And when the Baha'i faith was brought to the United States by a Syrian doctor, he found a hearing audience with people like our great-grandparents. And he began to see himself as kind of a leader. And then when he went to pilgrimage in 1898, the first pilgrimage of Baha'is from the West, and actually met Abdul Baha, he also came into contact with family members who were jealous of Abdul Baha, and he became influenced by them. So when he returned to the United States and all of these people to whom he taught the faith, he wanted to be seen as the Abdul Baha of the West, so to speak. And you have this very petty but very real effort to take what he perceived to be his power and leadership. And so Abdul Baha had to come and explain things, and he was very firm about this. In fact, our grandfather, Leroy Ioas, saw Abdul Baha one night talk about this in the home of Corinne True, and he remembered that it was like, because Abdul Baha could become very severe when he talked about this topic of the covenant and of being obedient to it. And Leroy Ioas remembered it being like watching an Old Testament prophet. You know, the Old Testament prophets are very famous, like Jeremiah, for warning people about certain lines not to cross, and the covenant was one of them. The Baha'is of Chicago, where our grandfather was living, were very excited to have Abdul Baha come. They'd corresponded with him, but had never met him. And so they made arrangements to go to Jane Addams Hull House, to the NAACP meeting, and especially to the National Convention and the groundbreaking of the House of Worship, which is in Wilmette today. And they built that put up a big tent, and that's the photo you see today with Abdul Baha with the shovel. This was the first time they were seeing them. And so it was a very powerful, and it was a life-changing experience, especially for my grandfather. I'm just going to insert here a little personal note, because I don't know where else to say it. My grandfather did not have a lot of formal education. He went to high school, but he didn't have a master's degree, bachelor's degree, certainly not a doctoral degree. Very practical man. He came up in American society the old school way. He was an immigrant. He started in the mailroom and climbed the ladder of the company he worked for Southern Pacific. So that was very much his role, very practical, very hands-on, very no-nonsense. I think that's some of the qualities that Shoghi Effendi really appreciated about him. But my point of bringing this up is my mother married a graduate of Princeton University, obviously a very good school in this country, and all of his friends were highly educated. My grandfather on my other side was a Princeton professor of French literature. People spoke multiple languages. And my grandfather came to speak at her wedding. Leroy Ioas came, and my mother was nervous because she knew that her father was a simple man in the sense of not all these degrees and all of this. But Leroy Ioas educated himself by reading and rereading the talks of Abdu'l-Baha. And we have them here in our home, and you can see little notes in the margins that he made. And he followed that pattern. And this is how he educated himself. And she once told me that she had never been more proud of him than when he stood up at her wedding and in front of all these highly educated Princetonians and Harvard and spoke and really, I don't know what the word is, moved them, impressed them, made them laugh. She really was very proud of that, because I think, she felt, well, they were, even though, because Baha'is now we see him as a hand of the cause, in fact, they were from very humble roots. I have a picture of them before they left from Germany, and they were essentially farmers. They were all dressed in front of a sod house or a wood house, whatever. So Abdu'l-Baha came to Chicago, and Leroy had the chance to see him several times, along with his parents and siblings. And he said that when you would look at Abdu'l-Baha in his eyes would always change. Sometimes they would be very stern and severe. Sometimes they would be extremely loving. Sometimes they were filled with pathos. Sometimes they were filled with joy. And among the most famous stories is when they were going to come to meet Abdu'l-Baha at a hotel, and he was Leroy was with his father, and they stopped to buy these white carnations. And as he's approaching the hotel, Leroy changed his mind, didn't want to give the flowers because he felt like he was calling attention to himself. And so he gave them to his father to give to him. And so the father gives the flowers to Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha, while he's speaking, was smelling them like that and then speaking to people. Abdu'l-Baha was very spontaneous. I don't know if you know this about him. He was actually very, very spontaneous. And so he was doing it, and then he was giving the flower to people. And like a lot of Baha'is remember, Leroy had a similar experience in which he was thinking, oh, I hope he turns around and looks at me and shakes my hand. And Abdu'l-Baha did turn around, and he pulled one of the roses that he had in his coat with him. And as he knelt or bent down to give them to Leroy, he pricked his finger, because roses have those thorns, and so some of the blood was on it. And he gave this rose with some of his blood on it to Leroy, and Leroy kept that the rest of his life. So Danush, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Beautiful. Okay. In 1917, Charles Ioas had been ill and passed away at the age of 58. All children were gathered at his bedside. Leroy had a strong sense that his father's work was not yet done. For some time before his passing, Charles Ioas had been busily engaged in working out and writing certain things relative to the cause, which he hoped to use for the diffusion of the knowledge of God. All this was to give Leroy for further impetus toward dedicating his life to serving the cause. 2 years later, Leroy was engaged to Sylvia Coleman. Under the loving care of Leroy and the other Baha'is, Sylvia became a Baha'i. They became a very strong, united, and loving team. And it was Hugo Giacheri who said, any story about Leroy should include Sylvia. Shortly after their marriage, they moved to San Francisco in 1919, having seen the need for Baha'is in the West. It was Lua Getzinger and her husband, Dr. Edward Getzinger, who had brought the Baha'i teaching to the West Coast of America, arriving in California in 1898, teaching notable individuals such as Phoebe Hearst, widow of the senator and industrialist, Imogen Ho, Helen Goodall, Anton Haddad, Ramona Allen Brown, her aunt, the Latimers, and Ella Cooper, to name a few. No organization or structure existed among the believers in those early days in California and they happily mixed friends and Baha'is together in all their meetings. They did not know the 19-day feast. Abdul-Baha was closely guiding the development of the American community, and soon they received a visit of Mrs. Isabella Brittingham, sent by the master for the purpose of inaugurating these meetings. In 1908, the first 19-day feast was held in the home of Mrs. Goodall. And what a beautiful feast it was. She had filled every room with flowers. In 1911, the first Baha'i Assembly of the West was formed in San Francisco. Abdul-Baha sent the tablet calling it the Assembly of Abdul-Baha. A year after their arrival in San Francisco, Leroy was elected to the local spiritual assembly and was drawn into close association with Ella Goodall Cooper. Several months after his election, it was she who telephoned him with the terrible news of Abdul-Baha's passing. Leroy, who had just completed a long letter to Albert Windust in Chicago, he came back to add on the side, "We are broken and crushed and cannot believe the beloved of our hearts has gone. He has been the motive power of our lives, our inspiration, and our real existence. Where will we turn now? It is only through his increased confirmations that we will be able to go forward. May we all become real standard bearers." Leroy redoubled his efforts to take on responsibility. He became head of the reception committee, charged with greeting the new people who attended meetings. He worked on the committee charged with arranging speaking engagements and publicity for the visit to San Francisco of the renowned teacher, Janab Fazil. He was appointed corresponding secretary of the assembly with a mandate to correspond with all new believers in the San Francisco area and in other countries where they were known. This included many persons in Australia, where the Heidi Duns were teaching, and in South America, where Martha Ruth had been traveling. Thus, in spite of his youth and inexperience, Leroy was drawn into responsible tasks and soon into public duties as well. He was chairman of the public lectures held during the first teaching convention in 1923, presenting such seasoned speakers as George Latimer and Dr. Frederick Devlin, and he himself began to appear as a speaker at the regular public meetings. He followed the pattern of Abdul-Baha's talks. Slide 4. In the 1920s, a number of brilliantly successful conferences on the theme of world unity were sponsored by the Baha'is of the United States. The first, which was the inspiration for all the others, was conceived and carried out in 1925 in San Francisco. Leroy had always thought that prominent people in the country, those in positions to influence policy and institutions, should know of Baha'u'llah's teachings concerning world order. They should know what the faith stood for. They should espouse its principles and be invited to take part in its activities. Had not Abdul-Baha spoken at the invitation of a wide range of organizations? If these were pertinent and life-giving teachings, should they not be announced to their leadership and offered for their consideration? Had not Abdul-Baha called upon California to raise aloft the banner of world peace? Leroy took his year's holiday to carry out the organizational work for the World Unity Conference with all its myriad details. When necessary, he was able to be both conceptualizer and the one who coped with the detailed work. The statement of purpose read is what you see in the board. The purpose of this conference is to present to the public of the Bay region and those interested in the welfare of humanity the spiritual facts concerning the beauty and harmony of the human family, the great unity in the diversity of human blessings, and this harmonizing of all elements of the body politic as the pathway to universal peace. The three-day conference convened in March 2021-22 of 1925 was to be free of any denominational sponsorship and be a gathering of public spirited people to further the spirit of brotherhood. No collections were to be taken. It was the San Francisco Baha'i Association that assumed responsibility for all expenses. The conference was to be held at the dignified and prestigious Palace Hotel. They were able to interest the Chancellor Emeritus of Stanford University, Dr. David Starr Jordan, in serving as honorary chairman. Leroy took this concept of World Unity Conference with the NSA, and they were propagated throughout the US. Leroy became a pillar of the faith in the West. The common denominator of his activities was the teaching work, in which he played his part in many fronts: speaker, administrator, organizer, provider of spiritual sustenance. Hand of the cause William Sears wrote to the NSA Secretary David Rue, "Teaching is always the dearest thing in the world to the heart of Leroy. Perhaps the most gifted of all teachers I have known at answering these questions of seekers at fireside meetings." It must be said that with the historic visit to America of Abdu'l-Baha, an entirely new spiritual awareness was born. The result was a more systematic approach to the teaching work. The gifted traveling teachers, who were numerous in specific areas, made efforts to visit, encourage, and deepen the newborn Baha'i groups. Some even went outside the continent to become the first North American settlers and traveling teachers in other lands: Alaska, Hawaii, India, and even Persia. Earlier, the annual convention of the Baha'i Temple Unity, while primarily focused on the needs of the house of worship, soon developed into a forum for consultation on teaching. Then Abdu'l-Baha began to lay the foundation for his own teaching plans, which he composed during World War I and sent to America for implementation. Within several years of his visit, he informed the believers that the time was ripe to establish spiritual assemblies, one of whose primary tasks would be the diffusion of the fragrances of God and the exaltation of his holy word. In other words, teaching. In 1920, 1 year before the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, a national teaching committee was appointed for the first time. Following that, a major pillar of the administrative order foretold in Baha'u'llah's will and testament came into being. It was the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the US and Canada, elected in 1925. In 1925, the NSA of the US and Canada, as one of its first initiatives, issued a call to 45 of the thoroughly informed, experienced, and distinguished Baha'is, quote, to make a supreme effort to spread the teachings throughout the continent. The call was addressed to such souls as May Maxwell, Martha Ruth, and Mountford Mills. In 1929, Leroy was appointed to the National Teaching Committee. Next slide. In 1932, he became member of the National Spiritual Assembly, the youngest person to serve on the national body. As you can read from under this slide here, 7 of the members of this distinguished National Spiritual Assembly went on to become in the future the hands of the cause. Next slide. A letter written by the secretary of Shoghi Effendi said that he was very glad to see your name among the members of the National Assembly because it shows that new blood is entering the administrative work. In another letter, Shoghi Effendi writes, I write to reaffirm my deep sense of satisfaction at your having been elected a member of the National Assembly, which I feel confident you will fill with ability and distinction. He goes on, may Baha'u'llah guide and sustain you. The next letter, the Guardian addresses Leroy as dear and precious co-worker. And 3 months later, I will pray for the extension of your invaluable activities, which I consider an asset to be prized and cherished by every sincere lover and promoter of the cause of God. 2 years later, the Guardian writes through his secretary, it gives me much pleasure to realize how effectively you are teaching the cause and how actively you are engaged in extending and consolidating the basis of its newborn administrative institutions. Leroy knew sacrifice from his own experience, standing for principle in itself a sacrifice of caring what people think of you, to extending the last ounce of energy to go out and do what is needed. Leroy had, next slide, Leroy had a profound respect for each human being. He remembered their names and what interested them. They were important to him, and their spiritual life was of concern to him. He never talked down to people. He talked as if you understood what he was saying, which was one of the things that made him a great teacher. His capacity to apply the teachings to the affairs of life and to explain the teachings in terms of the trends that were taking place in the world was really outstanding. He would find newspapers, magazines, etc., those things of significance to the teachings and how the faith explains current affairs or history or economics. To summarize the attributes which contributed to his success as a teacher, you read them here. He based his teachings on scripture. He lived the teachings. He respected each human being. He elevated people to a new vision. He showed the relevance of the teachings to world problems. Leroy was not only a speaker, but another aspect of his teaching was the stream of letters which came from his pen. He took great pains to help and encourage them. In a letter written to pioneers Ellsworth and Ruth Blackwell in Haiti, he writes, "You have fulfilled the Guardian's highest wishes." And he confirmed and gave the following example. It was the master's habit to look at the accommodations given his retinue, and he saw that Fujita was given a very small room. Fujita was a Japanese who had become Baha'i with Helen Goodall in Los Angeles and served 40 years in the Holy Land. He asked Fujita if it were large enough, and Fujita answered that anything was good as long as he was with the master. Abdu'l-Baha replied, "Here on earth, Fujita, they may give you a small room, but I guarantee that in heaven, you will have a mansion." Then Leroy added the point to the story. You two are building your mansions in heaven. I wonder what Leroy Ioas would have said if he were here today. Undoubtedly, he would have said that some of you are building your mansions and that there are a lot of opportunities for those of you that would like to build your mansions. A week ago, my wife was telling me that Taroneh Achavon, one of the council members, was telling her of a need for home front pioneering in Culpeper, 2 or 3 hours drive from Northern Virginia. You'll be the focal point of Baha'i activities and will be supported by the institutions. Let's hear what Leroy Ioas says in his talk. This is the talk he gave in South Africa, somebody referred to earlier.
Teaching the cause is disseminating the power of the Holy Spirit. And when you become a teacher of the cause, you become a channel through which the Holy Spirit descends into the world and goes out to those to whom you teach. So that actually the teacher secures greater benefit from his teaching services than the one whom he teaches, because he is then in contact with the power of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Payman. Another letter has to do with Mark Toby, a world-famous Baha'i artist. He had returned from China and had described Dr. H. Sao's efforts on behalf of the Baha'i community there and passed on Dr. Sao's request for a compilation on the teachings on economics. Leroy immediately responded. The Guardian has recently stated, he writes, that these statements of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha are principles of economic stability and not arbitrary parts of a program. In other words, the spirit of economics, as enunciated by Baha'u'llah, will have to be applied to situations existing in various parts of the world until finally world conditions develop to the point where the full economic structure contemplated in the Baha'i teachings can be established. On another occasion, he writes in response to questions that are troubling some of the Baha'is in regard to future cataclysm. Quote, the Guardian does not discuss these matters very much, he writes. He has been definite in his statement that we should not dwell on this, but that we should redouble our efforts in the prosecution of our plan, and that will in itself mitigate the difficulties. Why people should worry about these things and make them a major consideration in their thinking and way of life, I don't know. God surely is able to direct and assist his chosen ones in all circumstances. And to think of running away or speculating on the punishment of humanity is wrong. It is a Christian residue stemming from the belief that the world will be destroyed. The chosen would be lifted above the earth while the destruction takes place and then return to enjoy what is left. In another letter, he praises two pioneers who used their money to serve. You two have demonstrated that funds coming into your hands increase your service to the faith rather than decrease it. In so many cases, money causes individuals to lessen their Baha'i service until finally they serve the funds rather than letting the funds aid them in serving the faith. He often spoke of over-administration of the faith in America, which he felt took the time of the individual believers on which all teaching work depends. I will share with you a few pictures, dear Payman, please. Okay, now most of these are self-explanatory. This is Leroy in front of the temple in Chicago as it's being built, as he was very much involved with that. Next. Let's see, this is a group of friends, and I can't really see very closely, again, taken in front of the temple site. Next. This is the two individuals here are, help me out, Payman, it's Mr.
This is the dedication of the National Hazard to Quotes, a
With-
sacred school
Balyuzi.
Balyuzi, yes.
Yeah, it's Mr. Balyuzi and Leroy Ioas. Thank you, Pema. Next. These are the hands of the cause in the Holy Land in 1957. I believe it was taken just after the passing of Shoghi Effendi. Next. This is Leroy Ioas representing Shoghi Effendi at the conference in Kampala, Uganda, one of the 5 intercontinental conferences. Next. And the second picture, the same one. Yeah, thank you. Next. This is with Mr. Bush in the middle, and I'm not sure who the shorter gentleman is on the right, and Mr. Ioas on the left. Next. This was with Mr. Who are the Mr. Collins? Go ahead.
Yes, in Jakarta, with Hand of the Cause, Agnes Alexander and Colis Featherstone and Mrs. Featherstone.
Thank you. Next. This is with Rafi and Mildred Motahedeh. Next. Oh, this is a beautiful picture. This is on the left of Mr. Ioas is Mr. Kazemzadeh, and on his right, or on our left, is Mr. Banani. These were the group of 7 that came to the US on the famous 7, they call them. And my uncle Nasrullah Rassekh was among them, and Shidan Fateh Azam was another one. That was 4, and there were 3 others. But they went to the West Coast, a few of them, including my uncle and these 2 gentlemen. They went to Stanford, and they all became professors, different universities, University of California, Yale University, and Stanford, and then Lewis and Clark for Nasrullah. But this is a beautiful picture. I had never seen of these people. Anyway, that's the end of this. Thank you very much. So after 28 years in San Francisco, officials of the Southern Pacific Railroad wished Leroy to take on more extensive responsibilities, which would require his move to Chicago. He turned to Shoghi Effendi for advice. Shoghi Effendi indicated that it would be desirable for him to be closer to the heart of the national work. Move to Chicago, highly meritorious, he was told. The new position was prestigious and satisfying, and Leroy Ioas had brought many innovative ideas to railroading. And during his tenure in Chicago as head of the passenger services, Southern Pacific achieved wide recognition as the outstanding railroad in America in this field. Hilary, it's you, please. Thank you.
We'll talk a little bit about Southern Pacific, but before that, just a few scattered thoughts, memories about San Francisco. The San Francisco Baha'i community is the one my mother and her sister were raised in. There were 2 girls in the family. He had 2 daughters, and they spent their summers at a little Baha'i school that he and Bosch and George Latimer and others organized. Mark Tobey was often there, called Geyserville Baha'i School. And it was taken over by eminent domain years later by the state of California. But there's still, the property is still there, and the old tree that all the Baha'is gathered under, where when you see old photos of Geyserville, that's what you see is there. And the Ioas family, because they went every summer, had a little cabin that they had for themselves. It was very, very rustic. But the 2 daughters, Anita, my mother, and Farouk, her sister, both went every summer there, and it eventually, moved to Bosch Baha'i School. And today at Bosch, and I saw it for the first time last year, a beautiful grove of those enormous redwood trees, and it's the Ioas Grove. And it's there because Leroy Ioas and Sylvia and the 2 daughters spent their summers there and were very important in helping the school to grow. Another memory is that my mother, when she was a little girl, remembers that my grandfather would burn the candle at both ends. He would get up early and then he would go travel teaching at night. And that meant very often having to get on the ferry, take a bus to the ferry over to Oakland. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bay Area, and then take another bus and then take a bus and a ferry and a bus home. So getting home very late. And he would do a lot of this teaching himself. So he was very eager to develop other people. And this was always a common challenge for him, was how could he get people involved in that aspect of the teaching. And so my mother remembers him well into the night typing often letters that he would write to people, because he was a prolific letter writer, and then groaning in the morning because he'd have to get up very early. And those two sounds were kind of of her girlhood, of her young girlhood. And what's sweet is that I was her caregiver in the last years of her life, and she was mostly in her room the last 2 years. And she had a keyboard there and a monitor, a desktop, and I write. That's what I do, and so a lot of that is just typing. And it was sweet because at the end of her life, she'd always like me to come in there, and if I had work to do, which I always do, would be to type, and it would remind her of her childhood when she would listen to her grandfather. And they typed in those days on little tiny typewriters that big, Olivetti's. If you see Shoghi Effendi's, there's a famous photo of him typing and he's bent over and it's a tiny typewriter. I don't know how Shoghi Effendi did that amount of writing on that small a thing, that kind of physical pain alone of doing that. Lastly, I wanted to mention that he met my grandmother, Sylvia, and a lot of his ability to do the things he did was because he had Sylvia. And my grandmother was a very sweet, very strong, very devoted Baha'i, very quiet. She managed the house. It was very traditional. She raised the two daughters. And he often, as he got kind of brought into this Baha'i work, very often was away also for his job with Southern Pacific. But she was a very important part of it. And then later, when they were in Haifa, she served on the International Baha'i Council, which was like not a precursor of the Universal House of Justice, but it was a secretariat that worked to support Shoghi Effendi there in the Holy Land. And she was one of its members. She was a very capable, quiet, and she loved being his wife and supporting him. And they met in those days, I think this would be the 20s now, you didn't go on dates. So they met as young people in groups in their living room where there was a piano, and my grandmother played the piano, and they would sing. So everybody would sing songs together, and that's how they got to know each other. And then they chose each other for marriage. In terms of Southern Pacific, he rose up through the ranks in Southern Pacific the old way. He started in the mailroom and then went up and up and up because he was very competent, because he was very can-do. You know, he got things done. And I think that's a quality that Shoghi Effendi loved in him. He was also very interested in issues of race. In the 1920s, it was a high mark or low mark, depending on when you see it on, of racism in this country. the Jim Crow laws were intense. To give you an idea, in 1926, I think, he, down Pennsylvania and in Washington, D.C., there was a major parade of the Ku Klux Klan, and they were in full white robes. And Wilson had just a decade earlier resegregated the federal employment so that many Black American families lost a very good income stream as federal employees when it was resegregated. And the Great Depression, as you probably know, that hit the United States around 1921, hit Black Americans much sooner because they were much more sensitive, since their economic situation was very tenuous. They were much more sensitive to economic problems, and they were hit very, very hard. In 1919, there was a terrible summer of racial violence, of white people in different cities attacking Black neighborhoods, including here in Washington, D.C. And in 1919, my grandfather happened to be in a Black neighborhood in Chicago where there was a prominent and very active Black Baha'i named Mrs. Mary Clark. And while they were in that neighborhood, he was able to save a Black person who had gotten stranded on a bridge. You know, it's absolutely terrifying when these mobs start to go through streets. And he was able to rescue this one person from a bridge. And then a group of the Baha'is went to her house, to Mary Clark's house, to protect it from this insane mob. And he was very interested in the cause of the rights of Black Americans. So in 1925, he was made the head of the employees union of, what was it called? Of Southern Pacific. Yeah, Southern Pacific Employees Club, they called it. And eventually it was organized into a union, and my grandfather worked for better pay, better living work standards. The porters on trains for Black Americans in 1925 was a very good job. And the good job was the thing which changed the fortunes of Black Americans, because they could then buy land, buy a house, go to school. This was the key thing, was the job. That's why Wilson's work was so destructive in the federal government. And this Pullman porters were very good jobs for Black Americans. And he worked hard, and then A. Philip Randolph, very famous labor organizer, finally organized a union sometime later in the 20s. And last thing I wanted to say about this is he was very active in San Francisco in the NAACP. And this gave him access to speaking to and with prominent Black Americans. The Jim Crow laws made it very difficult to teach the faith if you were white, to teach to Black people, or vice versa the other way. This was extremely challenging. If you read Lewis Gregory's life, you'll see all about that. It was very dangerous for Black Americans. It was very difficult for white Americans to have, Black people over, and what the neighbor is going to think, and what's my landlord going to think. He was very active in the NAACP, and it was a point of pride for him, not ego, but he really loved this because he was a joiner. He joined the Rotaries, he joined other clubs when he was a hand of the cross in Israel, but he was a lifetime member of the NAACP, and he was the first white lifetime member of that organization. He was also invited by the Cosmos Club in San Francisco, which was a Black social organization for prominent Black business people and professionals. He was made by the Cosmos Club a honorary member. And so this gave him an opportunity often to speak with Black Americans about the Baha'i teachings. Danush?
Thank you. Okay, so we're December 24th, 1951. This is when Shoei Effendi announced the historic decision to appoint Hands of the Cause, which included Leroy Ioas. His response within hours: "Dearly beloved guardian, am completely overwhelmed. Your gracious appointment, one so unworthy as myself as Hand of Cause. Beg God for the strength and capacity to serve you humbly and well, loving devotion." Another cablegram arrived just after: "Make no plans to visit." This was followed by a letter from his secretary, which said, "In considering the entire situation here, the Guardian has decided, as he cabled you, that it is not advisable to spend the time and money to merely come here for a few days visit and consultation. What he needs, I might almost say desperately, is a capable, devoted believer to come and really take the work in hand here, relieve him of constant strain and details, and act as the Secretary General of the International Baha'i Council. If you accept to do this, it would be rendering him and the faith an invaluable service." Leroy cabled the Guardian: "Letter just received. Sylvia and I, deeply moved, privileged, serve beloved Guardian. If satisfactory, I will arrive March 10th, devoted love." A 2-word cablegram came back: "Welcome, love, Shoei." There was a brief, agonizing hesitation as Leroy turned the decision over and over in his mind. Executive of a big company, looking to retire with full pension. It was Sylvia who cut through this and said simply, "Of course you will go." Leroy wrote to his brother, "Sylvia has been much stronger than I. How God ever gave me such a wonderful wife, I don't know, but I'm grateful he did." The abruptness of his departure stunned everyone and made a profound impression on the Baha'i community. Marian Hoffman was to say later that she felt Leroy's obedience to the wishes of the guardian prepared the American Baha'is for the call 1 year later for them to quit their homes and scatter to every country, inland, island, and territory of the earth under the 10-year crusade. Shoghi Effendi told Leroy that in addition to the work of the International Council, he had decided to appoint Leroy as Assistant Secretary to the Guardian, handling certain correspondence over my own signature on his stationery. This would relieve him and would relieve Ruhiya Khanum. He spoke of other work Leroy would be doing. He said, "You have cared for the temple, now you will care for the finishing of the shrine. You have cared for the landscaping of the temple. Now you will care for the landscaping of the shrine and the surroundings of Bahji and the shrine of Baha'u'llah." Later, Sylvia wrote, "Leroy, I feel that your whole life has been one preparation after another just for this time." Next slide. Very rapidly, Leroy found himself busy all day. This was the rhythm set by the example of the guardian. Ruhiya Khanum shared a vivid picture of that life at the WOMED conference in 1953. Haifa is a place where 1,000 things happen every 5 minutes without the slightest warning. This slide will come later. Payman, thank you. After the evening meal, it became Leroy's privilege to escort the guardian home through the north door of the Pilgrim House, along the pathway, and across Persian Street to the master's house. And this he did each night. It was one of the rare times when he was alone with the guardian, other than the occasions when they would drive to visit a site or some work in progress. It also became Leroy's privilege to accompany the guardian and Ruhiya Khanum to and from the airport when they traveled abroad. In speaking of the shrines in later years, Leroy would point out that they are not places of the dead, though they shelter the remains of the manifestations of God. Rather, they are places of dynamic life because the spirit of the age flows through them. One evening, the guardian remarked that when visiting the shrine of the Bab, one should remember that the spirits of all the prophets of God are revolving around that shrine. But what then of Baha'u'llah's shrine? Leroy asked. The spirits of all the prophets revolve around it, including that of the Bab, replied the guardian. When Shoghi Effendi acceded to the guardianship in 1921, the Holy Land was governed by the British under a mandate given it by the League of Nations after the First World War. With diligence and care, the guardian built a cordial understanding over the years between himself as head of a world community and the British authorities. Although the authorities may not have appreciated the import of what they termed, quote, the movement over which he presided, in a sense, both the knighthood conferred by Great Britain upon Abdul-Baha and the time spent by the guardian at one of England's renowned centers of learning forged links of confidence and trust. With the ending of the mandate in May 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Haifa, of course, had been the site of the Baha'i World Center since 1868, when Baha'u'llah was banished to the neighboring fortress of Akka. From the start, the Israelis were very correct in regard to the faith. One of the early steps taken by the new government was to place markers on the property of Bahji, isolated as it was, to protect it from entry or harm. Within a brief time, all Baha'i properties and holy places were exempted from taxation, and large shipments of construction materials and objects of beautification for the buildings and gardens were permitted in the state duty-free. The authorities were grateful, moreover, that the Baha'is opened their holy places and gardens freely to the public. The year the Baha'i International Council was established, more than 1,000 persons visited the remote mansion of Baji during Passover week. The officers of the council immediately began forging links with the authorities by making friendly contact among them, the Minister of Religious Affairs, the mayors of Haifa and Akka. In the early years of the state, any matter relating to the Baha'i Faith came under the jurisdiction of the Minister for Islamic Affairs, a situation which deeply upset the Guardian, who did not rest until a Baha'i department in the Ministry of Religious Affairs had been created. Leroy Ioas set about calling on officials, and within a few months had met all those whom he felt necessary for his work. In fact, Leroy rapidly grew to know many Israelis. He spoke openly to them about the Baha'i Faith. The protection of the faith at its World Center had precedence over any other consideration. When you lived in Haifa, as Leroy learned, one quickly became cognizant of the need to protect the faith. I believe all caring Baha'is are sensitive to this point in the Holy Land. Leroy knew he was to make friends for the faith. He and Sylvia attended many events as possible in the interest of meeting a wide spectrum of people. Even though the council was nothing and the Guardian was everything, nonetheless, the formation of the council had been reported in several foreign languages and had resulted in articles on the World Center and Baha'i activities in Israel. Leroy, as the designated public contact person, noted a steady increase in calls and requests for interviews and information. Leroy joined several renewing memberships in the Rotary International, which with its weekly luncheon meetings proved an excellent platform for speaking of the faith. His first public talk in the Holy Land was at the Rotary Club in Haifa just 6 months after his arrival. The following year, he spoke before clubs in Nahariya, Netanya, Beersheba, and Akka. The Guardian was very happy with this. Leroy was presented as the Secretary General of the Council, but he generated interest also because he was an American and had chosen to live in Israel and had given up a good business career to do it. One of Leroy's interesting encounters with a government dignitary occurred at a 1959 reception celebrating the founding of the Knesset, an event to which the Baha'is were always invited. It was a lengthy conversation he had with Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, then serving that position for the second time. Leroy had met the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, before in the United States. When the Prime Minister was there, he had invited the delegation from the National Assembly to go and meet him. So Sylvia and Leroy were mingling among the guests when Ben-Gurion, who found himself near Leroy, said, "Mr. Ioas, I want to talk to you." Leroy immediately asked if he should come to his office. "No, we'll talk right here." "You're an American," said Ben-Gurion. "Baha'u'llah was a Persian." He pronounced the word perfectly. "What is there in the writings of Baha'u'llah, a Persian, that makes you a Baha'i and one of his followers?" Leroy said he could answer in several ways, but the simplest was to point out that the world today is seeking peace and conciliation. And certainly the one who has contributed the most profound concepts to the idea of peace and whose writings include the clearest program for the establishment of world peace is Baha'u'llah. As I have always been interested in working for universal peace, I'm a Baha'i. "Now listen," replied Ben-Gurion, "this is a social program. What is it that makes you, an American, a follower of Baha'u'llah? Leroy said, I will tell you in another way. We believe that from time to time, God chooses a certain individual to be the mirror of his revelation. This person usually arises in one of the most decadent places in the world, and he raises the people out of that decadence to found a great civilization. Leroy spoke of Egypt and Moses, of Jesus, Muhammad. So we, he continued, feel Baha'u'llah has now come to create a civilization based on oneness and unity. That's why I'm a Baha'i. Moses, replied Ben Gurion, took his own people, the Jews, and created a great civilization. Now, if you tell me that Baha'u'llah is going to take the Persians and make a great civilization out of his own people, yes. But what is it that makes you, as an American, follower of Baha'u'llah? Leroy said, Mr. Ben Gurion, I will explain it to you this way. The Baha'is believe the cause of the evolution of society is religion. Any religion is renewed by the appearance of a divine man who is an expression of the Holy Spirit. Leroy continued by explaining the wider sphere of unity created by each figure, and it continued. It was a long conversation, and at the conclusion, the Prime Minister said, well, we must talk some more. A few days later, Leroy happened to meet the Prime Minister's executive aide and asked how it was that Mr. Ben Gurion knew so much about the Baha'i faith, as he has asked very pointed questions a few nights earlier. His aide replied that Mr. Ben Gurion had Baha'i books in his personal library. And what is more, he said, he has read them. On another occasion, I think you saw this slide earlier, when Leroy and Mason Remy went to greet President Ben-Zvi and his wife at the Megildo Hotel and drove back to the house of Abdul-Baha, where they were warmly received by the guardian and Ruhiyya Khanum. The president remarked that the faith was not unknown to him. When he and Mrs. Ben-Zvi were married, they were very poor and wished to see the Holy Land. They set out to hike the length and breadth of the country. They came one day to the property of Bahji. There at the shrine, they met Abbas Effendi, who was very kind and courteous to them, taking them into the shrine of Baha'u'llah and then to his tea house where he served them tea. This visit with the master, extraordinary in retrospect, had been their first contact with the Baha'i faith. So we can see from the time of Abdul-Baha and Guardian, great pain was taken to develop a good relation with Israel. And it continues to this day, and it includes all of us by our actions when we visit the Holy Land. I have a Jewish friend. Years ago, he was with his sister and told her, I have a friend and he's a Baha'i, he's nice. The sister had replied to him, all Baha'is are very nice. I was in Denver years ago, and my friend's son-in-law, we were invited to a black tie event, which was a Jewish fundraising event. The son-in-law of my friend was one of the organizers and had paid for one round table of 8 people, about $3,000. Not knowing, I found out that one of the goals of the fundraising was raising money for Baha'i refugees. Amazed me. And I think I probably was the only Baha'i there. Abdul-Baha enjoined upon the hands of the cause to edify the souls of men, to spread the divine fragrances, to be the defenders of the faith. Each of the hands undertook these weighty spiritual responsibilities in their own manner. The work of the hands of God in Haifa, however, was dissimilar to that of their colleagues in other countries, as their sole function was to serve Shoghi Effendi. Next slide. Shoghi Effendi considered Leroy's work as his assistant secretary charged with all correspondence concerning the global teaching campaign, to be part of his work as a hand of the cause. It was not the direct teaching that was implicit in Abdul-Baha's words, and which Leroy loved, but through it, he could encourage the pioneers and keep the National Spiritual Assemblies focused on the goals of the plan. Okay, Hilary, sorry.
As you all know, Shoghi Effendi passed away totally unexpectedly. Of course, everybody knew he was mortal, but they just didn't think of, oh, he's going to die. Nobody was thinking like that. I mean, when the 10-year crusade was launched, the 10-year crusade is really what transformed the Baha'i Faith into an international religion because of the amount of people who went abroad, many of them Americans, many of them Iranians, and settled in all parts of the world. So it was completely unexpected when Shoghi Effendi died. The thing that was even more troubling, as you all know, is that he had no children. And when you read the dispensation, there's lots of writing by Shoghi Effendi about the future guardianship and the relationship with the House of Justice. Well, all of a sudden, what happened to that? Well, so there was a very serious issue of now what is the source of authority, which always in religion is the main question. Where does authority flow from? We are in a situation that we didn't expect to be in, and yet there they are. And the hands of the cause, they sealed Shoghi Effendi's apartment. Then they unsealed it and went through it, since they were the next level down, so to speak, of authority. So they went through it. They found no will anywhere in his apartment. So they declared there's no will. And then they looked through the whole Baha'i writings, and there was no authority for them to invent some kind of system. But fortunately, as you all know, from the Aqdas and from Shoghi Effendi, and in Abdul-Baha's writings, there are provisions made for the election of a House of Justice. And Shoghi Effendi envisioned that happening at the end of the 10-year crusade. One of the reasons for the 10-year crusade is to establish enough national assemblies that there would be enough pillars to have a universal House of Justice, not just 4, 5, 6 countries. And the crusade was very successful in that respect. And so the hands of the cause went through they found nothing. But they did find in Abdul-Baha's will and testament this section saying that the hands of the cause of God must elect from their own number 9 persons that shall at all times be occupied in the important services and the work of the guardian of the cause of God, etc. He goes on. I won't read the whole thing. And so they decided they would have a secret ballot, choose 9 of them from among themselves, and they would stay in the World Center, and they would be the kind of the nerve center, not the leaders, but they would lead the Baha'i community through to the end of the crusade based on the plans of Shoghi Effendi. And that's what they did. And the 9 who stayed there were Ruhi Khanum, who was Shoghi Effendi's wife, Charles Mason Remy, who was an extraordinary Baha'i in many ways, even though the end of his life was quite shocking and sad. In the early 1900s, I've read things that he wrote from 1910 and 1905, and they're superb. He had a very deep understanding of the Baha'i Faith. He was very devoted in many ways. And you may not know this, but he designed some of my favorite temple, which was the one in Uganda. And he also designed the one in Australia, and he designed the one that's yet to be built on the top of Mount Carmel. He traveled all over the world for Shoghi Effendi. He was trusted greatly by him. Then another of the hands of the cause who stayed in Haifa was Amelia Collins, who gave much of her wealth to the Baha'i World Center. Danush was talking about the institutions, and all the early plans, one of the main things of the plan was build up the Baha'i World Center, build up the Baha'i World Center, build up the Baha'i World Center. We don't hear about that much because it was successful. So we don't hear about that much now. Leroy Ioas was another. Then another of the custodians was Hassan Balyuzi, who was probably the first widespread Baha'i historian. Ali Akbar Furutan, who had traveled, taught all over Iran, was very well known to Iranian Baha'is, served as the Secretary of the National Assembly there for years, including during the terrible persecutions in the 50s. And there was Jalal Hazeh, who was I think my grandfather's best buddy among them. I think he was a military man, and my grandfather was also very like that kind of very direct, no nonsense approach. And then Paul Haney, a devoted American Baha'i whose mother was pregnant with him when she met Abdul Baha and felt like this was a sign. And then Mr. Faizi, who was a pioneer to Arabia, and John Farabee, Horace Holly, who was really instrumental in developing the administrative order in this country, was a playwright and a dramatist, and William Sears, whom you all know. And so they served there together, kind of holding everything together. And then when the Universal House of Justice was born, then they signed away all authority to them. And then the faith was really safeguarded in 1963. And they were the custodians of the faith during this very, very tenuous period. And how tenuous it was? Well, in 1960, Mason Remy, who had been one of the pillars of the Baha'i faith around the world, I don't want to try to find an analogy today, but he was just a pillar of it, decided that he should be the next guardian. There wasn't a Shoghi Effendi. He had been president of the Baha'i Council. But of course, the Baha'i Council was mostly existed to help Shoghi Effendi interact with the state of Israel. That's why the Baha'i faith is in such good standing, is the careful work that they all did. And Mason Remy was the president of it. President, these were just titles given so that, as Danush was saying, they could go to events and say, I'm so-and-so of the thus and such, and they'd have a title. So I'm president of the International Baha'i Council. Well, Mason Remy was a very capable, very gifted man, and he was the president of the Baha'i Council, but he did get it into his mind that he was the next guardian. He wrote to national assemblies and told them to turn to him. And this was incredibly shocking. I don't want to give an analogy today because I don't want to pick out a famous Baha'i or well-known Baha'i, but it was just incredibly shocking that this would happen. My grandfather was completely thrown off, but in a way, for my grandfather, it was a blessing. And the reason it was because in his personal life, he had had great tragedy. And that is, he found out earlier in 1960 that his daughter, Farouk, my mother's sister, was terminally ill. And my mother had been taking care of her, had been her caregiver, but she had been shy about letting him know about her illness because, you know, he was doing the World Crusade, he was with Shoghi Effendi. So he had the feeling of, I don't want to bother my parents with this. And so she really tried to manage her sister's health. But eventually it was clear that that health would not be managed. And so she wrote to him and said, you know, your daughter is not well. And this was really shocking to him. And he came to the United States and was very, you know, obviously, as you can all imagine, of children, she was not a child, but she was his daughter. And then my mother got married, and then that was my aunt's last outing. She was in a wheelchair, and then she died soon thereafter. And he was very, you know, upset's not the right word, hurt, and, you know, grieving. And then this thing from Mason Remy came. So in a way, you know, I've always had a fondness for that because it brought them all out of their depression, their funk, and they swung into action and back to Israel and, you know, the cause and this thing. And then most, I don't know if you know, but most people did not accept Mason Remy's claim, of course, except for many of the French members of the National Assembly in France, who later then broke the covenant, and who my mother all knew and my aunt all knew. My aunt also, one last word about her. She was a pioneer to France. She really helped build that Baha'i community there so they could have a national assembly. And she also, in the 50s, there was a plan to have Baha'i communities in each state capital of the United States, each province of Canada. And so she went to Boise, Idaho. Because one day, I didn't know that until I found one day in a box a letter from the Boise, Idaho. So, well, our family's never been associated to Idaho. Nothing wrong with Idaho. We have no connection. Why we have a Boise, Idaho letter? It's because Farouk had been there and had helped them establish their first Baha'i group or assembly there. So I wanted to say that, and I think that's all I was going to say about that. And then he lived on in Israel after the House of Justice was appointed. You know, he stayed hand of the cause there. But Israel was not like today. For those of you who've been there, it gets hot in the summer. It gets really, really hot. And Haifa is like this, you know, it's up and down the hill. And contrary to another thing, the members of the House of Justice, the hands of the cause, they didn't have chauffeurs. I'm not sure they had air conditioning. I know my grandmother had a very hard time with the basics in the 50s, like hairpins. And I know those were a big issue because she had pride of appearance. She liked to dress well. So you saw the photos of my grandfather. He always had nice suits. And so she dressed very well. Those of you who know my mother, she dressed very well. They had great pride in that. So my grandmother struggled in Israel because you couldn't find even basic things. It was a startup country, if you will. And there was a lot of chaos, which we won't get into in the beginning of the state. And so he lived on there for a few more years and then became very, very ill in a heart condition. He was, like a lot of American men, was a big meat eater, was a carnivore, and loved steak, and a meal with steak. And that was very American, very, very much a thing you wanted. And he couldn't get a lot of it, evidently, in Haifa, because he would ask my grandmother about that. And then he quietly passed away, and my mother spent the last months of his life with him. And it was the first time actually in her life in many years where she actually got to spend time with him, because he was, when you're ill in the hospital, you can go nowhere. So she spent long days with him. So in a way, that was a blessing too. And my grandmother outlived him by many years and came back to Alexandria and served the faith there, and was a wonderful woman.
Thank you, Hilary. That was beautiful. I'll just kind of end with this. Leroy Ioas loved two persons above all others. That was his mother and his wife. And when he left his mother in 1952, it was with the knowledge that he may not see her again. She was 87 years old and of delicate health. When she would weep whenever she spoke of him, but gradually this sorrow changed to pride as she learned of the services he was being called upon to render Shori Effendi. Shori Effendi comforted her with a note attached to a letter acknowledging a contribution to the Shrine of Above. The work in which your very dear and highly esteemed son is now so devotedly and actively engaged in is highly meritorious in the sight of God. Be happy and confident, for his self-sacrificing labors will be richly rewarded by Baha'u'llah. Leroy and Sylvia received 2 cables on May 25, one asking for their prayers for Maria had gone into coma, and the second sent a few hours later telling of her passing. Amelia Collins ordered the car, and the 3 of them went to Baji to have prayers for her. The guardian had not intended coming for dinner that night as he was pressed with urgent work, but he did come and expressed his deepest sympathy and said he will pray ardently for her. The guardian then told Leroy of a plan he had conceived sometime earlier. Quote, "You remember on the 29th of April, after placing the plaster from the ceiling of Maku under the golden tile of the dome of his shrine, the Bab's shrine here, I expressed my appreciation of what you had done. I had a gift and reward for you, which I thought of telling you when the shrine was completed. Now I am going to give you that gift and reward, with the hope that it will lessen your sadness. The one remaining door of the shrine will be named after you. You owe this to Sutherland, who designed the shrine in such a way to have 9 doors. There are 8 doors on the ground floor and 1 door the 9th door is in the octagon. It is the door that gives access to the dome of the shrine, to the portion of the shrine with which you have been associated." It was then, as you see on the screen, it was Hugo Giaccheri who wrote to Leroy a week later. He said, "The news of the door, Baha'i Ioas, as it shall be called, has brought me great happiness, because it rewards you in all eternity for all your labors, sacrifices, sufferings, and the hundreds of obstacles and difficulties you have met in carrying out the completion of the shrine. Thank you. Hilary, it's you.
That's it for me. That was what I was going to say. So thank you everybody for listening. I hope that was enjoyable. And Payman, over to you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for accepting and really preparing so much and sharing these memorable and sweet stories, which really, allows us to relive and kind of see what great sacrifices many have made in the past for this great faith and will continue to make. And I think Danush is promoting for us to read the book, of course. So now I know we're kind of come up to our time, but if anyone would like to ask a few questions, and if Danush and yourself are available for a few more minutes, Hilary, maybe we can take a few questions before we end with the closing prayer.
I just had one question. Mr. Ioas and Conchita, who were living in Northern Virginia, they were in our Baha'i community. What was his relationship with you, Hilary?
Charles Ioas was the son of Monroe Ioas. Monroe was the brother of Leroy. And Conchita was the first Baha'i in the Balearic Islands. Isn't that what was the island which she was from?
Iberia?
No. Off the coast of Spain. She was Mallorca.
Mallorca, yes.
First Baha'i there, and he was a knight of Baha'u'llah for that island. And well, some of you knew him, so that's the relationship.
Thank you.
And what was the background? Were they from European background, or where did they originally come to the United States from? Your grandparents?
They're Germans from the Czech-speaking German area, kind of southern Germany. That's where they came from. That was the immigrant story. They were typical immigrant stories, and a lot of German Americans. People don't remember now, but German American was the major European ethnic group, so to speak, 100 years ago in this country among European immigrants. It was by far the most widespread, and they went especially to the Midwest, and that's what the Ioas family did. Ioas is really I think a Czech name.
Shazza, did you have your hand up earlier, or was that this is not there? You had your hand up earlier, or was that just by mistake? Okay. Any other questions or any thoughts or anything anyone would like to share?
I see a Leroy Ioas cluster, somebody on their screen. Is there a cluster by that name?
Yes. There were Baha'i
Yes, there is.
that name, and yeah.
It's near Joliet, Illinois. It includes Wilmington, Leroy Ioas' birthplace.
Very nice.
Very good.
Well, I was just going to say I have been thinking about this for a few days, ever since I saw the invitation for this talk. I know that my mother had a picture of him, Mr. Ioas, with her and Mrs. Qobat Varga, the daughter of the older Varga, the sister of the Hand of the Cause, the latest Hand of the Cause, Varga. He had come to Iran. I am not sure what the reason was, but there was a committee in Tehran that was formed at the encouragement of the Guardian for advancement of women. And both my mother and Mrs. Varga were members of that. And because they spoke English also, they had gone to an American school. So a lot of Westerners who came to Tehran, Baha'i Westerners who came to Tehran, they were in charge of hosting them and taking them places. So there was a really sweet picture. It's in my mind, and I have my mother's albums. I tried to find it and send it to you for this talk, but I couldn't find it. But he was in Iran at some point.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to the speakers again. As you know, we have these meetings every so often. If you're signed up for the Northern Virginia Baha'i Announce, you always get the emails and the announcements. As you know, this meeting was formed or done by the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center Events Task Force, and we have regular events. And then this session will be put on in the Baha'i Center YouTube channel. So if you'd like to share it or watch it again, it will be there within probably a week or so. We now are going to finish the meeting and close with a prayer. Thank you.
Thank you, Payman John, for all your hard work. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
عزیزان عبدالبها هرگاه غمی داری آزار میبینی به شما جفا میکنند و ستم روا می‌دارند. شما بزرگوار و دلیر و مهربان باشید و این مناجات را با عبدالبها در میان نهید. هوالای پروردگار بی کسم و بی نفس خاشاکم و خس ضعیفم و بس تویی فریاد رس.
Well, good night, everyone. Thank you again for joining and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah,
Thank you. I love her beautiful presentation.
thank you.
Thank you. I love her.
Thank
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, friends.
It was wonderful.
Hi, Bahia. Good night.
Long time no see, huh? Thank you, Danush. Thank you, Hilary. Wonderful.
Bye, Albertson. Nice to see you all. Bye.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Hillary, you were beautiful. Thank you.
Yes.
Is he gone? Maybe.
Thank you, Paymonjan, too. That was
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Spent a lot of time.
Thank
Have
you,
a good-
Paymonjan.
Thank
I
you.
have graduated from the Paymon School.
It was a pleasure. You did a great job, Danush. All your hard work paid off. So it's wonderful.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Good
Well
night.
done.